alien science academies, adopt human peer review because our methods ensure quality. Part 1. The explosion lit up the void of space like a dying star. Dr. Sarah watched from the observation deck as the faster-than-light communication array tore itself apart, taking 3 orbital platforms and 17 dignitaries with it. The shockwave reached her station moments later, rattling the reinforced windows and sending coffee floating across the zero-gravity lounge. Around her, alien scientists from a dozen species stood frozen in horror. The delegation made a sound like wind through broken glass, their crystalline bodies dimming with grief. The representatives coiled their serpentine forms, eye stalks retracting. Even the usually stoic Morpheus collective rippled with distress, their gelatinous forms losing cohesion at the edges. Sarah felt sick. She had read the paper, she had seen the flaw. The Galactic Scientific Consortium had invited humanity to join just 6 months ago, a historic moment for Earth. Humans were the newcomers, the primitives who had only just discovered faster-than-light travel through sheer stubborn experimentation. Sarah had been honored to represent Earth's scientific community at the consortium's annual conference. She had spent weeks studying their papers, trying to understand alien methodologies and physics that operated on principles Earth was only beginning to grasp. The communication array had been the centerpiece of this year's conference. Instantaneous communication across any distance, no relays required, no time lag. It would revolutionize everything. The paper had been brilliant, dense with mathematics that hurt to read, filled with concepts that required four-dimensional thinking. But there on page 47, Sarah had found it, a sign error in the quantum field equations. Small, almost invisible, but fundamental. The kind of mistake that could turn a revolutionary device into a bomb. She had told herself she must be wrong. The paper's author was Quinn, the most celebrated physicist in history. The paper had been reviewed by the consortium's finest minds. Surely they would have caught something so basic. Sarah was just a human, new to galactic science. She must have misunderstood something. Now she stood watching debris tumble through space, and knew she had been right. The consortium's director addressed the assembly 3 hours later. The leader stood at the podium, their scales dulled with exhaustion, speaking through a translation device that rendered their hissing language into flat, emotionless standard speech. "This tragedy will be investigated thoroughly," said. "The Empire has our deepest sympathies. The consortium will provide all necessary support to recover and rebuild." Sarah stood, her hand shaking as she raised it. Around her, dozens of alien eyes, sensors, and perception organs focused on her with varying degrees of surprise. Humans didn't interrupt. Humans listened and learned. That was their place. "Director," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I believe I know what happened." The silence in the chamber felt heavy enough to generate its own gravity. "Doctor," said, their tone careful, "you have findings to present." "I reviewed the paper last week," Sarah said. She activated her, projecting the equations onto the main screen. "Here, in the quantum field calculations, there's a sign error. It's small, but it propagates through the entire design. Instead of creating a stable field, the array would create a cascading feedback loop. The mathematics predict exactly what we just witnessed." The chamber erupted, not with agreement but with anger. "Preposterous." A scientist rose, their 6 arms gesturing sharply. "Quinn is one of our greatest minds. This human suggests they found an error that our finest reviewers missed." "The arrogance," hissed a delegate, "to come to our consortium and immediately question our methods." "The paper was reviewed by the High Council of Science," said an administrator, their crystalline voice sharp as breaking ice. "Do you suggest they are incompetent?" Sarah felt heat rise in her face. "I'm not suggesting incompetence. I'm suggesting that everyone can make mistakes. That's why we have review processes. But if the review process doesn't catch errors..." "Our review process has served the galaxy for 10,000 years," interrupted not unkindly but firmly. "Doctor, we appreciate your enthusiasm. However, perhaps you misunderstand the complexity of the work. These are advanced concepts." Sarah sat down, feeling dozens of eyes still watching her. She heard the whispers, translated by her earpiece into a dozen overlapping voices. Typical human presumption. They barely understand warp theory. Should never have been admitted to the consortium. The conference continued. Sarah said nothing more. But that night, alone in her quarters, she went through the consortium's database. She started pulling papers from the last 5 years. Not the successes, but the failures. The gene therapy that had been approved and then caused mutations in 40,000 patients. The stellar maps that had been certified accurate, then led 3 ships into a black hole's event horizon. The agricultural innovation that had sterilized the crops of an entire colony world. She read each paper carefully, and in each one she found the flaw, not hidden, not particularly subtle, but there. The kind of error that any competent reviewer should have caught. The kind of mistake that happened when people assumed credentials meant correctness. By morning, Sarah had compiled a report. She requested a private meeting with director, expecting to be refused. To her surprise, the director agreed. His office overlooked the station's central garden, a carefully maintained ecosystem combining plants from 30 worlds. The director gestured Sarah to a seat designed for bipedal species, then coiled their long body into their own resting platform. "You have been busy," Doctor said, their eye stalks focusing on Sarah's. "I saw your access requests in the system." "I found the errors," Sarah said simply. She projected her findings. The therapy, the maps, the agriculture system, all approved by the consortium, all containing fundamental flaws that caused disasters. Was silent for a long moment. When they spoke, their voice was quieter, tired. "I know." Sarah blinked. "You know." "I have suspected for some time that our review process has problems," admitted. "But the consortium is built on respect and tradition. When Quinn submits a paper, who are we to question them? When the High Council of Science approves it, how can junior reviewers suggest it is flawed? We assume that those with credentials, with experience, with proven genius, do not make basic errors." "But everyone makes errors," Sarah said. "That's not an insult, that's just reality. The best minds in human history made mistakes. Hawking, Curie. Brilliant people, revolutionary discoveries, but still human, still fallible." "And how do humans address this?" asked, genuine curiosity in their tone. "Peer review," Sarah said. "Independent verification. We assume papers might be wrong. We actively look for flaws. We require evidence, reproducible results, clear methodology, and we do it blind." Blind. The reviewers don't know who wrote the paper. The author doesn't know who's reviewing it. A graduate student can critique a Nobel laureate. Status doesn't matter. Only the science matters. Stalks recoiled slightly. "You remove identity. How can you evaluate a paper without knowing the author's credentials?" "The credentials don't make the paper true," Sarah said. "The evidence does. The methodology does. The mathematics do. We've found that when reviewers know who wrote something, they're more likely to approve work from famous scientists and reject work from unknowns. Not because of malice, but because of unconscious bias. Blind review helps eliminate that." "This sounds very human," said slowly. "Very combative." "It's not combat," Sarah said. "It's quality control. We don't assume anyone is trying to deceive us. We assume that everyone, including ourselves, might be mistaken. So we check, we verify, we question. Not because we don't respect each other, but because we respect the truth more." Was silent for a long time, their eye stalks moving independently, a sign Sarah had learned indicated deep thought. Finally, the director spoke. "The consortium will not change easily, Doctor. Many species view questioning as disrespect, criticism as attack. What you describe would be seen as chaos." "More chaotic than exploding space stations?" Sarah asked quietly. more chaotic than mutation plagues and lost ships. Scales rippled, the equivalent of a wince. You make a fair point. Very well. I will propose an experiment to the consortium. We will test your human method, but be warned, Doctor. If this fails, humanity's reputation in the consortium may not recover. Sarah nodded slowly. And if we don't try, how many more disasters will we approve? Part 2. The consortium's main assembly chamber could hold 5,000 beings. Today, it was packed. Sarah stood beside Director at the central podium, feeling very small and very alone. The Director's proposal had sparked outrage across the scientific community. For 3 days, Sarah's inbox had been flooded with messages ranging from curious to hostile. Addressed the chamber in their measured way, explaining the experiment. 10 papers currently in the approval process would be reviewed twice, once through traditional consortium methods, where senior scientists from each species would examine work from their own kind, knowing the authors' identities and credentials. Once through human-style blind peer review, with trained reviewers from multiple species examining papers anonymously. If the human method proves superior, we will consider reforms, concluded. If not, this matter will be settled. The ambassador rose immediately, their scales flushed with anger. This is absurd. You propose we hide our identities, that we strip away the context necessary to evaluate complex work. Science requires trust, Director. The human method is built on suspicion. A researcher gestured with multiple arms. My people have advanced beyond such primitive approaches. We recognize that wisdom accumulates with age, with accomplishment. A junior scientist cannot possibly evaluate work at the highest levels. They lack the necessary framework. The humans barely understand quantum mechanics, added a Morpheus Collective representative, their gelatinous form quivering with indignation. Now they presume to teach us methodology. Sarah had been warned not to speak unless called upon. She bit her tongue, hands clenched at her sides. But others spoke in support. A young researcher stood, their fur rippling nervously. Perhaps we should listen. My mentor's gene therapy was approved through our traditional process. Now 40,000 of my people live with mutations. If there was a better way. Your mentor is a genius who made an unfortunate mistake, snapped an elder. That is different from systematic failure. Is it? The young researcher challenged. How many mistakes before we admit the system has problems? The debate raged for hours. Finally, called for a vote. The experiment was approved by a narrow margin, though many delegates made their disapproval clear. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks training alien scientists in peer review. It was harder than she had imagined. The first session included a dozen volunteers from different species. Sarah presented them with a sample paper, deliberately flawed, and asked them to review it. The volunteer wrote 3 pages of praise for the author's elegant equations, never mentioning that the conclusions didn't follow from the data. The reviewer caught every error but phrased their review as a personal attack on the author's intelligence. They refused to critique at all, saying it would be disrespectful to question another's work. Okay, Sarah said, trying to keep frustration from her voice. Let's start with basics. Peer review isn't about the person, it's about the work. You're not attacking the author, you're checking the science. But how can I say their mathematics are wrong without implying they are foolish? Asked the. You don't say they're wrong. You ask questions. Like, can the authors clarify how they derived equation 7? Or, the data in table 3 appears to contradict the conclusion in section 4. Could the authors explain this discrepancy? This seems indirect, noted the. Why not simply state that equation 7 is incorrect? Because maybe it's not, Sarah explained. Maybe you misunderstood something. Maybe there's additional context. Good peer review assumes the authors are competent but possibly mistaken, not that they're wrong and you're right. You're starting a conversation, not winning an argument. A Morpheus Collective member rippled thoughtfully. This is strange to us. In our culture, pointing out errors publicly brings shame. We correct each other privately, gently. I understand, Sarah said. But private correction doesn't work when you're reviewing strangers' papers. And gentle correction sometimes means errors get overlooked because no one wants to cause offense. We need a middle ground. Professional, respectful, but thorough. They practiced on paper after paper. Sarah taught them to verify calculations independently, to check that data supported conclusions, to ask whether experiments could be reproduced. She taught them to distinguish between flaws that invalidated work and minor issues that needed addressing. She taught them to write reviews that were critical but constructive. The aliens struggled. They kept writing reviews that sounded angry. They kept deferring to author credentials. They kept apologizing for asking questions. The Morpheus Collective kept trying to find ways to approve everything. But slowly, they improved. After a week, the reviewer rewrote a harsh critique as a series of specific, addressable concerns. They caught an error in a paper by a celebrated author and wrote a respectful review explaining the problem. They asked hard questions without apologizing. The Morpheus Collective member rejected a fundamentally flawed paper, explaining clearly why the methodology was unsound. "You're learning," Sarah told them. "This is exactly what we need." Meanwhile, the traditional reviews were happening simultaneously. Sarah wasn't allowed to see those, but she heard rumors. Papers were being approved quickly, with minimal feedback. Senior scientists were rubber-stamping work from their colleagues. A few papers received minor corrections, but nothing was outright rejected. The human-trained reviewers, working blind, were being more critical. 3 papers had already been sent back for major revisions. One had been rejected entirely, a collaborative work from, and researchers that contained circular reasoning so obvious that even the novice reviewers caught it. The backlash started immediately. The rejected paper's authors filed a formal complaint. They accused the reviewers of bias against their species, despite the reviewers not knowing the authors' identities. They claimed the human method was designed to fail alien science. Dismissed the complaint but looked increasingly worried. "This experiment may tear the consortium apart," the director confided to Sarah. "Half the assembly wants your method, half wants you expelled." "Truth doesn't care about politics," Sarah said, though she felt the weight of responsibility. If this failed, Earth's place in the galactic community could be destroyed. The final reviews came in after 3 weeks. Called a closed session, only senior administrators and the experiment participants. Sarah sat in the small conference room, surrounded by alien scientists who viewed her with everything from hope to hostility. Displayed the results on the main screen. Of 10 papers reviewed both ways, the traditional consortium method had approved 8, requested minor revisions on 2, and rejected none. The human-trained reviewers had approved 3, requested major revisions on 4, and rejected 3. "A dramatic difference," observed, "but which method is correct?" An administrator gestured dismissively. "Obviously, the human method is overly critical. These papers were evaluated by experts in their fields. The human reviewers are rejecting work they don't understand." "Let's test that," Sarah said. She pulled up one of the rejected papers. "This paper proposes a new terraform technique. The traditional reviewers approved it. Our blind reviewers rejected it unanimously. Let me show you why." She walked through the mathematics, step by careful step. The paper's equations assumed that atmospheric pressure could be adjusted independently of temperature. They couldn't. The technique would create a runaway greenhouse effect. Instead of a habitable planet, you'd get Venus. "This is basic thermodynamics," Sarah said. "Any competent reviewer should have caught it. But the author is a celebrated. The traditional reviewers saw the name and assumed correctness." "One example proves nothing," argued an administrator. Sarah pulled up another rejected paper, this one proposing a new medical treatment. She demonstrated how the biochemistry didn't account for interactions with common medications. The treatment would work fine in isolation, but would be deadly for anyone taking standard blood pressure medication. The traditional reviewers, seeing the author's prestigious credentials, had approved it. The third rejection was a propulsion system with energy calculations that violated conservation laws. Basic physics, but the math was complex enough that reviewers had apparently not checked it carefully. These aren't subtle flaws, Sarah said. They're fundamental errors hidden in complex work. The traditional reviewers missed them because they were looking at credentials instead of content. And your reviewers caught them because they didn't know who to trust, said slowly. So they trusted nothing but the evidence. Exactly, Sarah said. Peer review works because we assume we might be wrong, all of us, every time. No matter how smart we are or how many papers we've published, we check and double-check because the cost of error is too high. The room fell silent. Then an administrator spoke quietly. Director, we should see all 10 papers, a full comparison. Hesitated, then nodded. They pulled up each paper and its reviews. Of the 8 approved by traditional methods, 4 contained errors ranging from minor to catastrophic. The human-trained reviewers had caught all 4. Of the 2 that traditional reviewers had flagged for minor revisions, both were among the 3 that the human method approved, with the human reviewers nodding they were solid work. The correlation was damning. Traditional review had a 50% failure rate. Human-style peer review had been correct in every case. This cannot be, whispered an administrator. Our methods have served us for. Your methods worked when science moved slowly, Sarah said gently. When everyone knew everyone, when communities were small, when credentials were earned through decades of proven work. But science has grown. The consortium spans hundreds of species, millions of researchers. You can't know everyone anymore. You can't rely on reputation. You need systematic verification. Part 3. The vote took 3 days. Sarah wasn't allowed in the chamber. She spent the time in her quarters, reading papers, trying not to think about what was happening. Earth's reputation hung in the balance. If the consortium rejected the human method, humanity would be seen as arrogant newcomers who presumed to lecture ancient civilizations. If they accepted it, everything would change. On the 3rd day, summoned her. The director's office was dark, the garden lights dimmed to mimic the night cycle. Looked exhausted, their scales dull, eye stalks drooping. They gestured Sarah to a seat. The vote was close, said without preamble. Many still oppose the human method. They see it as destructive to our traditions, to the respect between scientists that holds our community together. Sarah's heart sank. They voted no. They voted to hear one more piece of evidence, said, and something in their tone made Sarah look up sharply. Doctor, I must confess something. The experiment was not entirely as described. What do you mean? Of the 10 papers reviewed, 3 were written by humans, submitted under human names from Earth institutions. I included them to test for bias. Sarah felt cold. You thought the alien reviewers would be harder on human work. I thought it possible, admitted. Resentment toward newcomers is common, but the results surprised me. The traditional consortium reviewers approved all 3 human papers, every single one. Because Earth has a good reputation now, Sarah said slowly. Because we discovered FTL independently, because our early papers were solid. They saw human names and assumed quality. Exactly, said. But the blind reviewers, human-trained, rejected 2 of the 3 human papers. Sarah stared. Our own papers. The errors were legitimate. One paper had flawed experimental design. Another made claims beyond what the data supported. The human reviewers caught these problems. They had no idea they were reviewing human work, so they evaluated it objectively. We failed our own quality control test, Sarah said, something between a laugh and a sob escaping her. That's actually perfect. Perfect. It proves the point, Sarah said. Blind peer review doesn't favor any species. It catches errors from everyone, including humans, especially humans, because we're not special. We make mistakes just like everyone else. That's why we built a system that assumes we're fallible. Stalks focused intently on Sarah. That is precisely what I told the consortium. The human method is not about human superiority. It is about recognizing universal fallibility. No species is exempt from error. No individual, however brilliant, is beyond mistake. What did they say? They voted to adopt blind peer review, with some modifications for species-specific communication needs. The vote was 62% in favor, not unanimous but sufficient. Sarah exhaled slowly, feeling tension she hadn't known she was carrying release from her shoulders. When do we start? Immediately, said. You will lead the training program. Every consortium member will learn the human method. It will take years. Many will resist, but we begin now. The resistance was worse than Sarah had expected. Some species saw peer review as a personal attack on their cultural values, though with their hierarchical society, struggled with the idea that juniors could critique seniors. Whose entire civilization was built on trust in expert consensus, found the systematic doubt uncomfortable. The Morpheus Collective, whose culture emphasized harmony, saw the process as creating conflict. But Sarah and her growing team of human trainers persisted. They taught thousands of alien scientists the art of constructive criticism. They showed them how to separate ideas from identity, how to question without insulting, how to verify without distrusting. They trained reviewers to look for specific red flags, unsupported claims, mathematical errors, experimental flaws, logical inconsistencies. The system wasn't perfect. Some reviewers were too harsh, others too lenient. Some papers got stuck in revision hell. Some good work was initially rejected by reviewers who didn't understand novel approaches. But gradually, the quality of approved papers improved. More importantly, the catastrophic failures stopped. 6 months after adoption, a young graduate student anonymously reviewed a paper by one of her people's most celebrated physicists. She found an error in the dark matter calculations. Without seeing her identity, the physicist read her review, checked his math, and discovered she was right. He thanked the anonymous reviewer publicly, corrected the paper, and advocated for blind review in his next lecture. A year after adoption, a team of researchers submitted a revolutionary new medical treatment. Human-trained reviewers caught potential long-term complications the team hadn't considered. The paper was sent back for additional testing. 2 years later, after those complications were confirmed, understood, and addressed, the treatment was approved. It saved millions of lives and never would have been safe without that careful review. Sarah stood in the consortium's main chamber 2 years after the experiment, accepting the consortium's highest honor, the Crystal of Contribution. Around her, thousands of alien scientists watched. Some still disapproved, but most understood now. The human method wasn't about humans at all. Thank you, Sarah said, holding the crystal carefully. It was an artifact supposedly grown over centuries in quantum fields, beautiful and heavy with symbolism. But I want to be clear about something. Peer review isn't a human invention. The basic ideas, the core principles, they've been discovered independently by dozens of human cultures over centuries. Ancient Greece, medieval China, Renaissance Europe, modern Americas. Every time humans gather to do science, we eventually figure out that we need to check each other's work. She paused, looking out at the assembled scientists. We're not special. We're not smarter than you. We just got lucky. We discovered these principles early in our scientific development, probably because we were suspicious of each other's motives. Humans don't trust easily. That's not a virtue, it's a survival trait from a divided world. But it led us to build systems that assume fallibility, systems that work for anyone who uses them. An administrator spoke up from the assembly. You say we should have discovered this ourselves, But we did not. Only humans developed blind peer review. No, Sarah said firmly. You developed peer review. Every species here has review processes. You just developed them when your societies were smaller, when credentials meant more, when personal reputation was a reliable signal. Those systems worked for you for thousands of years. They only failed when you expanded too fast, when the consortium grew to include hundreds of species. You didn't need blind review before. Now you do. That's not failure, that's adaptation. She set the crystal down carefully. The real lesson isn't about review systems, it's about something deeper. It's about humility, about recognizing that being smart doesn't mean being right, that having credentials doesn't make you infallible, that the best minds in history, human or alien, made mistakes, will keep making mistakes. And that's okay, as long as we build systems to catch those mistakes before they hurt people. Rose approaching the podium. Doctor speaks truth. The human method is now the consortium method, but we must go further. We must embrace the principle behind it, question everything, verify everything, assume nothing. A new voice spoke from the assembly, a Morpheus Collective member Sarah recognized from her early training sessions. Director, I propose we display this principle prominently, as a reminder of what we have learned. The proposal was adopted unanimously. Within a week, the consortium's new motto appeared in the main chamber, translated into thousands of languages. Question everything, respect everyone, trust the process. Sarah read it every morning as she entered her office. She still trained reviewers, though she had a large staff now. She still dealt with resistance, with species who found the human method uncomfortable, with researchers who chafed at having their work questioned. But she also saw the successes. Papers that were initially flawed being improved through revision, young scientists finding their voices, errors being caught before they became disasters. Earth sent more scientists as trainers, spreading throughout consortium space. They taught workshops on statistical analysis, experimental design, how to write clear papers, how to give constructive feedback. The humans weren't always right. Sometimes alien scientists taught them better methods, showed them flaws in human assumptions. The learning went both ways. 5 years after Sarah's first presentation, the consortium published its first fully blind peer-reviewed journal, accepting papers from any species on any topic. The journal's rejection rate was 70%. Researchers complained it was too harsh, but the papers it published were solid, reproducible, and reliable. Within a year, it was the most prestigious publication in the galaxy. 10 years after, a new generation of scientists had grown up with blind peer review as the norm. They questioned everything, not out of disrespect but out of habit. They caught each other's errors before publication. They built on each other's work with confidence, knowing it had been thoroughly vetted. The catastrophic failures that had plagued the consortium became rare, then almost non-existent. Sarah eventually retired from training and returned to research. She published papers in the consortium's journals, submitting them blind like everyone else. Some were accepted, some rejected. Her status as the human who introduced peer review didn't matter to the anonymous reviewers. They evaluated her work on its merits, exactly as the system was designed. One day, she received a review that rejected one of her papers. The feedback was detailed, respectful, and absolutely correct. She had made an error in her calculations, a small thing that propagated into a big problem. The reviewer had caught it, explained it, and suggested how to fix it. Sarah revised the paper, corrected the error, and resubmitted. It was accepted on the second try. She never knew who the reviewer was. It didn't matter. That evening, she stood in the observation deck where she had watched the array explode a decade earlier. The view was peaceful now, stars steady in the void, ships moving calmly through organized traffic patterns. No explosions, no disasters, just the quiet progress of science, checked and built on solid foundations. A young human researcher approached her, nervous and excited. "Doctor, I just wanted to thank you. I'm heading to a university to teach methodology, because of what you started." Sarah smiled. I didn't start it. I just explained what we already knew. The real heroes are the alien scientists who were willing to change, who admitted their systems needed improvement. That took more courage than anything I did. The researcher nodded and left. Sarah stayed, watching the stars. Somewhere out there, scientists from 100 species were checking each other's work, questioning assumptions, building knowledge together. Not because they distrusted each other, but because they respected the truth enough to verify it. Humanity's gift to the galaxy wasn't technology or tactics or strength. It was simpler than that and more profound. It was the recognition that everyone, no matter how brilliant, needed someone to check their work. That errors were inevitable but catastrophe was not. That the best way to honor intelligence was to question it, respectfully and thoroughly, in pursuit of something larger than any individual ego. The truth didn't care about credentials or species or reputation. It only cared about being found, and finding it required not just brilliance but humility. That was the real human contribution. Not the method itself, but the principle behind it, that being wrong was acceptable, even expected, as long as you built systems to catch the errors before they mattered. Sarah touched the window, feeling the cold glass under her palm. Out there, the galaxy was full of brilliant minds making discoveries, testing hypotheses, pushing the boundaries of knowledge. And now, for the first time in consortium history, they were doing it with their eyes open, checking their work, questioning their assumptions. Because everyone, human or alien, needed someone to tell them when they were wrong. Even Sarah, the human who taught the galaxy about peer review, had papers rejected, and she was grateful for it. That meant the system was working exactly as designed.